the Hello everybody, thank you for coming to our Times Talk today. My name is Xinyan Yang, I'm the co-director of ADP, and my co-director, my colleague, Dr. Daryl Hamlin, was back to New York. So today I'm having the honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Peter Tramel, and he's going to talk about the topic to bring us to the philosophical discussion on a very current and urgent topic. Thank you for coming.
Thank you and welcome. I'll try to. It does sound like maybe there's a microphone. Hopefully you can hear me in the back. Okay, good. I'm a little intimidated because I know there are people in this room who know more about the descriptive situation than I do. I do follow it, and I have followed it since I was interested in the news, even as a little boy. And one of my first memories of anything in the news was Munich, the Olympics in Munich. So I've been watching this happen for a long time. It's been happening since my parents' time and before. But what I can talk about a little bit are the aughts. So my expertise is not in the descriptive situation. I'm not a historian, I'm not a political scientist, I'm not even an expert in international law. However, that's the one I'm closest to because international law is mostly philosophy. It's not like positive, it's not like positive law, domestic law, that kind of thing. Most of the justifications for the principles of international law are philosophical, and often the only thing that can be done about it is philosophical argument. Anyhow, I think this topic's pretty discussable. There's so much here that I could have done this a lot of different ways and talked about a lot of different things. But I chose a kind of path through that hopefully will engender some good discussion. When we ask if something's a moral imperative, of course, if it is, then someone ought to do something. And if Palestinian statehood is a moral imperative, then there are lots of people who may need to do something, but there are three parties that particularly stand out, and that would be the Palestinians, Israel, and the United States. The United States as professed arbiter, or the United States as protector of Israel on the UN Security Council. As you may know, the UN often votes for Palestinian statehood and for limits on Israeli action against Palestine. But Israel is protected because they have a friend on the Security Council, us, right? So, I worry a little that this may become a moot point at some point in the near future. This is a picture of Palestinian versus Israeli occupied territory going from 1946 at the time of when the UN voted to give Israel statehood if they could defend it. It was an if they could defend it, and they had to immediately. And they not only defended it, but you can see how things went over the years in various wars. And this stops in 2008. Palestinian territory in the West Bank is much smaller now than in 2008. It's even smaller now than it was in October of 2023. A horrible time. So you can see how it's shrinking and how it's shrunk a little bit. If Palestine was to have sovereignty, then they would have, if they were to have statehood, they would have sovereignty, and that implies, this is an almost universally accepted definition, although what people mean by it, the devil in the details, goes all over the place, but supreme authority within a territory. So Kansas, for example, is not sovereign. It has authority within its territory, but is not supreme authority. The United States has supreme authority over this territory. We have people who don't like that or agree with that. We even have some sovereign citizens running around. But anyhow, supreme authority within the territory. This applies to most kinds of governments, whether the authority lies with a monarch, dictator, oligarchy, aristocracy, or people, whatever. It can be supreme even if the scope is limited, and there's lots of examples of that in the world. But a country can voluntarily, a state can voluntarily limit its own sovereignty by, for example, joining organizations like the European Union, putting their finances into a mutual kind of, their economies really into a mutual kind of management and so on. So they can limit their own sovereignty that way. They can limit their sovereignty through agreements that they make in order to gain sovereignty. Ukraine, for example, in 1991, in exchange for recognition of its sovereignty by the Russian Federation, it turned all of its nuclear weapons over to the Russian Federation. So it turned out the Russian Federation had to go on respecting that sovereignty, but they did limit their sovereignty in a certain way in order to gain sovereignty. Many countries are limited by deals they've made with the another name of it escapes me, that the World Bank, the deals they've made with the World Bank, the organization that controls that. Anyway. These limits can go so far, though, that sovereignty starts to be only an honorific, where there's very little, where it's so limited that there's very little that people retain any sovereignty over. I have the seals of some Indian nations, some Native American, some American Indian nations up here. And I chose these three because we call them sovereign. That, for example, the Seneca tribe lost to the governor of New York over whether they could tax cigarette sales. So we're not talking about a whole lot of sovereignty right there. It's sovereignty in name, but if you can, if you lose to the governor of New York about taxes on cigarettes, then you're not super sovereign. The Navajo Supreme Court recently ruled against their water rights in the Colorado River Basin. They are not a recognized party to negotiations over water in the Colorado River Basin. So their sovereignty is extremely limited and probably greater than most Native American people. And I put the Comanche up here just because they control more territory than any other Native American tribes. And now they're on a tiny little reservation north of Oklahoma with a smaller population than Paiutes. At one time, they controlled 2/3 of Texas, half of Oklahoma, Kansas south of the Arkansas River, eastern Colorado, eastern New Mexico, and parts of northern Mexico. Absolutely enormous territory. I'm going to come back to them in a minute for a reason. This looks like a bad choice of color schemes, huh? But that's supposed to be a picture from the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, the treaty that ends the 30 Years' War. Some scholars put the beginning of modern sovereignty at Westphalia. The nations of modern Europe were in some sense born then, and the system of nation states with many of the same features eventually spreads all the way around the globe by 1960. So the same kind of conception of nation states and the same kind of overview or overarching view of how they fit together and what their, what their sovereignty means. Persons and peoples left outside of this system that has encompassed the globe are stateless. And we would have to call it, maybe, in some very meaningful sense, the Palestinian people currently stateless. And they're not the only ones. You would say something about Rohingya, or if you think of other peoples, there may be about to be a bunch of stateless people who aren't allowed here, but aren't allowed back in the places we seek to support them. So there's actually a lot of stateless people in the world. It's a terrible problem because without the respect and representation within the system, even maybe to defend their right to exist or to be any place. Something about being homeless, if that ever happens, well, it doesn't, but is this, I don't have a right to be anywhere. You know, there's the police move you on as you try to set up your sleeping bag somewhere, they move you on, not here, and you realize at some point I don't have a right to be anywhere, and there are whole peoples like that in the world.
That's just okay.
I'm going to go through some preliminary considerations on both sides of the Palestinian statehood question. These are very general. I'm not going to get too much into the history and stuff, but it may very much come up in the conversation. And then there's a lot of going back and forth and a lot of bad things done by each side to the other, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot to talk about, but I sort of cut through that. One consideration in favor is there's no better way to grant them rights as a people. Arguably, that's important, that peoples have rights, whether they have states or not. And there's no better way to grant them rights as a people than full membership in the international system of sovereignty. There's no better way to ensure that their individual human rights are respected. There are some people, though, who will argue that they don't tend to set up any kind of state that would be very human rights friendly. We can come back to that. That's going to be something that people raise against Palestinian statehood, is that they're not a people with a strong history of respecting human rights internally and domestically. Fairness requires, we're going to get into a deeper version of this, but the version here is just that there are even smaller and less unique peoples who enjoy the benefits of statehood. Liechtenstein popped immediately into my mind. Liechtenstein also popped into my mind because the difference between Liechtensteinians and their neighbors don't look like much to us from far away. Other Alpine peoples, and you might wonder, well, how are they unique enough to be a state, right? And but up close, they may look unique enough to be a state. And I think that's relevant now that the president has joined the longtime Israeli Likud clamoring for the Palestinian people just to be resettled in other Arab nations. And many Americans look from afar and say, well, what's the difference? They're similar enough to Jordanians and Egyptians and Syrians that doesn't make any difference, right? But I'm told and I believe that up close it makes a difference, that these are not, the Palestinian people are people as distinct from Jordanians, Syrians, Egyptians. And some argue, of course, that it's essential to the long-term peace and stability of the Middle East. That as long as we don't have a solution in which Palestine gains sovereignty, we just continue to watch what we've been watching all of my life, and all of my parents' lives even. And we don't want that. And it hasn't been good to watch, and it's not something that we want to go on. But more importantly, of course, it seems wrong. It seems like a situation that there would be an obligation to correct it if we could. Some preliminary considerations against Palestinian statehood. They fail, these are criteria for earning, kind of traditional criteria. I'm not sure, we'll talk about whether they have a strong moral basis or whether they're more just tradition. But some traditional, they fail to earn sovereignty in according to some traditional standards. Mill's self-help test is a kind of tough parent, you can go to college but I'm not going to help you pay for it kind of view. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it basically just translates into kind of, you can have statehood if you can earn it, but we're not helping you. You have to go out there and earn and win the battles yourself. And then the Saratoga test, which I'll describe that again in a minute. This was a test that had existed in European views for hundreds of years, and the French applied it to whether or not they would help us with our revolution. I'll get into that. So the Palestinians failed these tests. October 7th is going to come up when we talk about this topic, no doubt. People will argue this demonstrates that Palestine cannot be relied upon to be a responsible member of the community of sovereign states. It's essentially an aggressive state. They fail Rawls' minimally decent state tests. That's a kind of a different kind of a test. It's a test in liberal political theory. So some people will argue that way. States, in order to pass this test, have to be fundamentally non-aggressive towards other states. Ought implies can. The last one,
Yeah.
and arguably, some will argue there's no longer any can. I'll come back to what this means in more detail. But basically, if it's not possible, then no one has an obligation to do it. And arguably, it's not possible.
Yep.
Maybe it was done.
Where is the citation for this?
Oh, that's ought implies can. I have all the citations on these slides, but ought implies can is such a famous saying of Immanuel Kant that I think it's kind of like, I don't know, say happy birthday or something.
It's not.
But it is from Immanuel Kant. It's just a,
You're saying these states ought to live up to these rules, but they don't because of their state, they're not able to.
no, I mean, if we have an obligation to create Palestinian statehood, it has to be possible. If it's not possible, then nobody has an obligation to do it. Just like you could tell me, Peter goes all world hunger report back and forth, something like that.
Nice.
You ought to go to Mars.
Yeah, we go to Mars. But I have no obligation to do that because I can't do that. On the other hand, if you said, Peter, do more to help with world hunger, then I would have an obligation to do that. And you could trace, I could.
See?
Just did the coffee springs, right?
That
Okay. John Stuart Mill, writing in the same year as Darwin's great book, The Theory of Evolution. Thank you, Origin of Species. That's it. Writing in that same year, but thinking especially about countries in Central Europe that were peoples who were trying to gain independence, mainly failing, Poland and Hungary especially, fighting in that period for independence, Poland from the countries that had partitioned it, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and Hungary fighting for independence from the Austrians. And the question arose in Britain and other countries, France, should we help them? Do we have an obligation to help them? And Mill argued no. He argued for this kind of self-help. This is what I compare to you have a right to go to college, but no one should help you. You won't become the right kind of person if somebody helps you. You'll be weak, and you need to develop your own character and virtue. And the only way you can do that is by paying for it yourself. Some parents have said this to their children. I know that for a fact. Speaking of that, and although nowadays there would be ought implies can issues possibly with the cost of college that didn't exist when I went to college. When I went to college, a little easier than that. But anyhow, so He says the right of a people to self-determination is the right of people to become free by their own efforts. He's viewing this kind of like a negative right. So you could say somebody has a right to eat. If that's a negative right, all that means is that everybody else has an obligation to refrain from preventing them, to stay out of their way as they try to eat. But if they still can't eat, they still can't scrape together enough money or whatever, or their crops fail or something like that, no one has an obligation to help them. That's a negative right. A positive right is a right to assistance. And so Mill's arguing here that the right to self-determination of states and peoples is a negative right, only not a positive right. Kind of libertarianism applied to the international scene.
Similar to Spencer too.
There's also, Spencer's kind of an evolution guy, and has also got an evolutionary, I mentioned
I
the,
don't think to leave it alone, let it evolve naturally.
yeah,
If it's functional, it'll survive, it's survived, no doubt at all.
it's kind of an international Darwinist view in effect, to put it into political.
Brother,
Yeah, that's why I mentioned the fact that it was the same year as the Origin of Species that he wrote this, because there are some similar, there's some similar thinking. Survival of the fittest.
It's that kind of thing.
Any outside help, he argues, would either change the nature of that people and interfere with their freedom to develop their own way of being in the world. It would fail to produce lasting institutions. They wouldn't have the character they need to make it in the world.
how did the United States pass that one?
We didn't pass any of this. we didn't pass any of this. Of course, we had enormous help from the French and some from the Dutch and so on. In fact, we were even saved, I don't want to go too far down, this is a direction, but we were even saved, I was reading not long ago, by people of Havana, Cuba. Because when Admiral de Grasse, Washington asked him to come bottle up the French at Yorktown, he wouldn't do it unless he'd be paid. Congress said no to paying him. The citizens of Havana, Cuba passed the hat and paid him. Otherwise the British would have just evacuated Cornwallis, and the revolution would have continued, revolutionary, we wouldn't have defeated them in Yorktown. That's a digression. but yes, I guess it is relevant to the point that, yeah, we did not live up to self-help. We did not come into existence through self-help. Mill would have been fine with that conclusion. As far as the United States deserving to be independent, he probably wasn't that sympathetic. He was a member of Parliament, not Congress. The only justification for third-party intervention to help one people gain another freedom from another is to offset interference by outside parties. So he argued that if there are outside parties that are interfering, like if Russia comes in on the side of Austria against the Hungarians, then the British could send troops to help the Hungarians, but only as many troops as the Russians sent. No more. Right? So all that would be acceptable would be to counter that outside interference. Applying this to Palestine would be a little difficult, but certainly there are people who make this kind of argument against Palestinian statehood, that they just fail the self-help tests. They haven't. Well, it would be better if I talk about the next one. So we will go to the Revolutionary War for a minute more in depth. This is the Comte de Vergennes. He's the French minister who Benjamin Franklin and John Adams were over there trying to talk into giving us help. And he took a standard from European history. This was kind of international law at the time, dated back to at least Grotius's book on the laws of the sea or something. Anyway, and this principle said you have to win a major victory. So it was a lower standard than Mill's. Okay, he wasn't total self-help like Mill, but you have to win a major victory. Otherwise, you haven't proved that you have the organizational capacity or the oomph, I don't know, to stay free. And so when Washington won at Trenton, his little ambush of the Hessians right at Trenton, then Franklin went running into the Comte de Vergennes' office saying, we did it, now send the troops. And he's, no, this is too minor. Also, we saw it as not sporting since we had ambushed the Hessians at Christmas. Well, they were drunk. So he said that it is too small and it's not sporting. So, but then we won at Saratoga. Big battle, captured the whole British army, Burgoyne surrenders. And okay, that does it. And the French sent troops. The Rochambeau comes over with some battalions to Connecticut, and then the French start fighting in the war for us. They've been giving us cannons and stuff all along, but anyhow, the Palestinians haven't passed this test either. No major victories. They've done a lot of nasty. They're still there, but they've done a lot of nasty little things. October 7th, maybe it's definitely up there among the worst.
State took over using like
They might, but it is. I mean, it is. It wouldn't be by the Virginia standard, right? And lots of nasty things have happened to them. So I'm not trying to be one-sided about this. But anyhow, nothing they've done is like a major military victory. They always, as far as like in terms of defeating armies, taking territory, they've had no success. Going back to what Israel will say about the justification for the Nakba, when the displacement of these people out of their home villages and stuff into crowding them into the West Bank and Gaza and so forth, is what they'll say is, well, we offered them citizenship if they stayed neutral while we were invaded by, when they declared independence, they were invaded by Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Egypt. And they told the Palestinians, if you'll stay neutral, we'll give you citizenship. The Palestinians did not stay neutral. They decided, not all of them obviously, but their sympathies, and they helped the invaders. And so afterwards, Israel claimed justification for driving them out of all this territory, the Nakba, and taking it over themselves. So if you ask Israel, what was the justification for this? That's what we're saying. They chose their side, they lost. See? Not implies can. If someone has an obligation to do something, then they can do it. Therefore, if something such as Palestinian statehood is impossible, then no one has an obligation to make it happen. There's different kinds of possibility that could matter. We don't mean logical possibility. If you can conceive it, it's logically possible. If you can say it and conceive it, it's logically possible. We don't mean physically possible. Of course it's physically possible. We don't even really mean militarily possible. I suppose our military could make it happen if we chose. But that's not what we're really talking about here. And I don't even know if that's true because, well, we live in the nuclear age. And that I think, by the way, being in the nuclear age, I think makes all those old-fashioned self-help tests and things seem quite this Darwinist sort of things. I guess it's just too many things become impossible that ought to happen. The most relevant kind of possibility for applying occupies can to the question of Palestinian statehood seems to be political possibility. But that's a tricky and difficult idea. Some things probably are politically impossible at given times, and maybe not at all times. I think that it would be a bad time to push for universal health care at the present moment. For example, there might become a time again when it might be a good time that, probably we could call that politically impossible right now. And many other things. And whether Palestinian statehood is politically possible, at different times it's looked differently, and it's probably never looked much worse than now. It seemed to look best here, 1993, 94, it actually seemed like it was going to happen, I remember. Perez and Arafat, Oslo Accords. It fell apart for a couple of reasons. It fell apart partly because of They couldn't agree about territory. Israel came forth with a proposal about territory. Perez did. That proposal would be a pipe dream for Palestine today. 73% of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, it was almost complete sovereignty. The only limit on their sovereignty was they were not going to be allowed to have any kind of military that could threaten Israel. Arafat was totally offended by it and walked out and wouldn't talk to anyone. Then he's besieged in Ramallah and dies. Lots of good conspiracy theories about his death. He was an assassination target for the Mossad for many years. How did man live to be 70 something? I have no idea. Not many people who've been on the Mossad assassination list live very long, I'm afraid. So he was amazing in that respect. Anyway, but even at this time, I don't know if it was politically possible. So even if Arafat had said, okay, we accept this, the right-wing forces in both countries, and by right-wing I mean their hardliner forces, the Israelis who want, no, this is our land, they need to all go. And the Palestinians, from the river to the sea folks who are, the Israelis need to all go. We're not accepting anything less than that. These people were furious about all this. Perez gets assassinated in a year by an American-Israeli right-winger. And Arafat starts to lose credibility and power to Hamas, which is from the river to the sea, Tramel. And so it's not clear that even if Arafat had said yes to the offer, or had even been willing to negotiate, like Perez said, okay, you don't like it, what could, let's talk about it. No, I'm offended, I'm not talking. So,
Peter, is it Shimon Peres, or is it Yitzhak Rabin?
I met Yitzhak Rabin. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's right.
Perez succeeded him, and Perez was not as friendly as Rabin to peace. Rabin was as close as they had to somebody who was friendly to peace. I met Rabin, and he's the one. Yeah, sorry, everybody. Okay, so that's better. That's Yitzhak Rabin. So that's the closest that it ever came to my knowledge. And the situation now is so far from that it's hard to imagine. And one reason that's so far from that is the Palestinians are no longer unified behind a leader like Arafat. The Palestinian Authority, the successor organizations, considered kind of discredited and powerless. They're just presided over the rest of the loss of the West Bank at the current connection. The whole time that we've been focused on Gaza being destroyed, they've been pushing settlement like crazy in the West Bank, taking the distraction, forcing Palestinians out of their homes and their towns, everything like that. That's been going on, ratcheted on a big time. So we're a long way from this. We have an Israeli government under the Likud who's not friendly to Palestinian Statehood action. In fact, some people accuse them of seeking the American Indianization. It's hard to say, the American Indianization of Palestine. That is, if they're going to ever allow any Palestinians to say sovereignty is going to be like this can be achieved. And now he's not going to be anything more than that. Maybe they won't even give that much. The Palestinians are disorganized, and the United States doesn't currently have the will, I think, to use its influence with Israel to push them in a different direction. Arguably, things have never looked less promising, so the occupies can argument seems strong at the moment, but not overwhelming, because political possibility can change, and I'm going to come back to that today. There's some obstacles too. The fact that Gaza is destroyed. These are all things I was talking about. Now, coming back to considerations in favor, I'll say a little more.
How am I doing? Sorry.
I guess I'll make this quick, because I do want to leave time for discussion. So I said these things, I'm just going to go to them right away. This idea that peoples have rights, not people like David, but peoples like, I don't know, the American people, the Palestinian, the idea that peoples have rights. It's tied to territory, like sovereignty a little bit, but people have interests at least. Does this mean they have rights? This is like even a debate in animal rights, and I don't mean to compare them except to say that animals have interests. Does that imply that they have rights? Some philosophers have argued yes, and somewhat persuasively they have to worry. But anyhow, the idea that peoples have rights would have to be based on the idea that peoples have interests, and they certainly do. The security of the people, the political independence of the people, the territory of the people, maintaining its political and social institutions, securing its proper self-respect as a people. I meant to kind of hint at that when I compared this statelessness to homelessness a little bit, with this sort of, it's hard to have self-respect when you don't have a right to be anywhere.
Right.
And I think as peoples, it's hard to have self-respect without that right too. That's John Rawls, by the way, a very, very important political philosopher, probably the most important of the 20th century, at least in terms of amount of discussion and literature generated by his work. He would stand above everybody else by a long way. He did do some work on this subject in the law of peoples. He died in 2002, though, so his book, The Law of Peoples, is worth taking these kind of private class. The fundamental interests of a people engender the rights and responsibilities of that people in the system of international system. In the international system of sovereign peoples. I wrote this down. I'll give you just a second on these. These are all things that Rawls claims are rights of people or responsibilities of people, and all of these are in the UN Charter. It's maybe in a slightly different language, but everything here is in the UN Charter. So the UN Charter does see peoples as having rights. Some people now view the UN Charter as pie in the sky. I'll come back to that. It was very liberal. It's very much influenced by the experience of World War II and wanting to prevent that from happening again through organizing the peoples of the world, not into a world government, but into a system of mutual help and respect that would hopefully keep peace and prevent things like the catastrophes like I just witnessed, a catastrophe of human rights. For example, in the Holocaust, but in the other cases, and a war that killed at least 50 million people.
Okay.
Whether we would say these are natural rights, like human rights, is another question. But we could think of them at least as like plausible utilitarian rights, by which I mean rights that if everybody would recognize them, we have a better world. If everybody would respect these things, we'd have a better world. People would be happier. There would be less suffering. Rawls wants to add this too, which would create an obligation for us, for example, not to support Palestinian statehood, maybe more actively. There are things we could do, not maybe under the current administration, but in the United States, if we just say, what can the United States do? Obviously, we could threaten to withhold arms, or withhold, I guess we did threaten, but we didn't. Obviously, we could withhold ours. Obviously, we could stop our protection in the UN Security Council and say, look, if you don't do this, then we're going to let the General Assembly handle it. Which can go up and lose it badly, right? what of outlaw states who fundamentally fail in their responsibilities to their own citizens and to other peoples? Now, when something like October 7th happens, then those who are against Palestine, it's a victory for those who are against Palestinian statehood in a huge way. Just like when Native American tribes committed massacres on the frontier. Comanches were, for example, pretty notorious. They were even all the other Native American peoples regarded them as sort of the best at torture, as not trying to say they only kidnapped and just sold slaves, and all kinds of things. Anyhow, then that gives all the ammunition, it gives all kinds of ammunition to the opponents of the statehood. Right. It's even to the point where countries who are trying to prevent them from being states, and I'm not going to make claims here, but some of my readings suggest that Israel has done things to make sure that Hamas was in charge and not the Palestinian Authority. And you see why they would do that? Because world support for Palestinian sovereignty goes down when Palestine commits atrocities and looks like an outlaw state, like a state. Because lots of people will argue there comes a point in which sovereignty has to be taken away, limited or taken away, like we did with Germany in 1945. We took the sovereignty away temporarily. However, it's supposed to be with the idea that it will be returned when they have just institutions and can be a responsible member of the world community, which is everything that supporters of Palestinian sovereignty would want to say, and but that they should be put on at least a path towards an opportunity to demonstrate that they could be a good member of a community of sovereign nations. This might necessarily mean that Hamas loses, and I didn't mention Iran, but obviously Hamas is supported by Iran, right? It's guarded by Iran, often taking orders from Tehran and so forth, so they're a player in this too. But I just mentioned outlaw states because these states did not respect the borders of other countries, as, for example, when Molotov agreed to divide up Poland in 1939. And these kinds of things, the Soviet Union did not respect other countries' borders. In Nazi Germany, obviously didn't. They also didn't respect, neither of these regimes respected the human rights of their own citizens in any serious way. Outside intervention can be justified when it will not do more harm than good, including temporary suspension or abridgment. I will just kind of wrap up, and I may skip a couple of things if I do want discussion. When it will not do more harm than good, including temporary suspension or abridgment of sovereignty. I just wanted to mention this as a quick example of an outside intervention that actually looked kind of beneficent and for the best, and that's when Vietnam, in the late 70s, did a military humanitarian intervention into Cambodia to drive the Khmer Rouge out of power. The Vietnamese felt that Khmer Rouge were an embarrassment to communism, and they were committing a genocide that killed over 1 million people in Cambodia. Maps of mass grave sites in Cambodia, but then the Vietnamese didn't stay and make the Cambodians have to have their form of government or anything else. They just drove the Khmer Rouge out of power, kept them out, let the Cambodians eventually choose their own form of government. It's more complicated than that, but they didn't have intentions of making Cambodia part of Vietnam, or making Cambodians into Vietnamese, or any of these kinds of things. So it looks like an example in history of a beneficent kind of intervention. It violates no self-help rule, but when you look at the before and after, it looks from a utilitarian point of view like strongly justified. I'm going to skip the other stuff I have. Some people consider the moral arguments, and the international law is really just a Hobbesian war of all against all, and all you can have is a modus vivendi, a way of getting along, which only lasts until one group feels powerful enough to violate it. And when one group feels powerful enough to violate it, then, as an ancient Greek once said, quoted by Plato, the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. And so some people are, sometimes they're called realists, and they have this kind of view that that's it, all you people talking about the morality or this or moral arguments. It's kind of like when Stalin asked Churchill, how many divisions does the Pope have? Like, Churchill had brought up what the Pope wanted at Potsdam, or one of the Yalta, somewhere, he brought up what the Pope wanted. Stalin said, how many divisions does the Pope have? That's super realistic. So, anyhow, so is this just pie in the sky to talk about the morality? Of course, we want to know what's right and wrong. But what about people we don't care? Does it really matter to nations, or is it just my think's right? We've seen, I think, sometimes cases where countries have tried to act poorly. And as far as political possibility, some things that weren't politically possible at one time become politically possible at another, so it's worth talking about them anyway. When Eleanor Roosevelt would come to her husband while he was president, Franklin, she would push for rights for African Americans and for him to bring civil rights to the South and end Jim Crow laws. And he would say it's not politically possible. And he wouldn't do it. She would push his push, he would say no. He would say, I agree. They should have rights. The Jim Crow laws should go away. But yeah, if I do that, then the Republicans win the next election, and it's all over. And anyway, maybe he was right. Maybe it wasn't politically possible in 1943 to end Jim Crow. But it was possible in the 1960s. I have a picture here of Dr. King Selma, who's John Lewis on the left and so forth. So sometimes working towards the political possibility of something, even in an era when it's not currently politically possible, can change things in the future. I'll stop there. I've talked to you already. So, welcome. Well, I'm happy to discuss anything. I'm sorry if I talked a little too long.
No, actually, in the criterion of people, I have look at, well, there's already an established culture. Because that's an argument I've heard Palestinians say, in counter to the phrase that some Zionists would be, which is land without people.
Yeah.
Well, I said, there wasn't no land without people. There were people there. They had movie theaters and car dealerships, for instance.
Yeah, no, they had a culture.
Driving culture in that time.
Sometimes people even kind of tell lies, like I've heard people say, oh, the Arab world didn't care about Palestine until Israel wanted it. But no, they had a whole people there.
History of culture.
And then history and culture, the whole
And
world.
that was cosmopolitan, too.
Yeah, it was cosmopolitan. It was
Yeah.
yeah, they'll also talk.
Multiracial, multi-ethnic, in a lot of places are like,
That's a good point. Have you ever read, anybody ever read Leon Yar's books?
no,
Some of you did. I did as a kid. I got kind of persuaded to be very pro-Israel in this. Because they're novels, but I tried rereading one not long ago and I couldn't do it. It was so saccharine, but as a kid I thought it was a good literature. And, but it's just like these hardcore with Israeli propaganda all through it. And the Palestinians were this backwards. It's actually kind of like how Americans justified taking Indian land. But they're backwards, they're savages, they're so on. One of the arguments ran that, some people just said we're just absolute racists and didn't care. But there were people who tried to justify taking the Indian land by saying, look, a utilitarian argument. We'll make more efficient use of these lands and they'll support more people our way. Which was certainly true of Comancheria, the land controlled by the Comanches. That at their height there were maybe 40,000 of them, and now if you think of the populations of Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Colorado, right, we're talking many millions. So they try to justify it that way, but it's just not true of Palestine. There are millions of Palestinians still in Palestine, and of course many more displaced, but we're still, and it is a distinct. So yeah, those kind of, the arguments that they're not a people just seem, if you want to argue for something that's seen, that it seems not right. I don't know, yeah.
I was wondering on those, where you were talking about Mill's self-help laws, on how if some people argue that Palestine doesn't follow those, but would Israel qualify for those because of the U.S. and Western?
Just because Israel's winning it would qualify.
even if they're winning because of that intervention?
Oh, well, that's actually tricky. You could probably argue that we shouldn't be arguing Israel. That's a good point. You could probably argue that that might justify counter-intervention on the part of someone else, like Iran, or arming Hamas.
Just as many soldiers or weapons.
Yeah, Bill would draw that limit, as long as they don't exceed the number of weapons that the U.S. gives.
Sure, long-scale bloodbath, yes.
Yeah.
Well, we gave them,
My sequel.
we gave them a nuclear arsenal. They're the only country in that area that has nuclear weapons, and so they've got the trump card for any kind of conflict.
Well, the nuclear age changes a lot of things. It seems like this, you have to win this tough parent thing, you have to win your independence in the nuclear age. We can't have some of these wars that would end civilization.
Well, they had nuclear weapons when they took over but they had a lot of help,
Yeah,
material help.
Absolutely.
From us, right?
absolutely they did. Yeah. No, I mean, so counter-intervention could be justified, I suppose, according to Mill. But just like if somebody's trying to keep me from going to college, and it would be justified for somebody else to stop them from putting that pressure on me. That no more.
Oh,
Fuck.
go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just thinking, under Weber's conceptualization of the state, states have a monopoly over the legitimate use of violence. And in this scenario, if Palestinians were to have a state, it's kind of hard to disentangle an instance where both Hamas and asserted authority, if there are attempts to restore public order within the boundaries of the Palestinian state, and there's actually the work of others. So
I don't even know how to sort that out. It's so complicated, and I don't even know enough facts about them to totally sort that out.
So in terms of like the conceptualization of a possibility, geopolitical possibility, logical possibility, can there even be a Palestinian state until we would reconcile the issue of what we has?
Probably not in that sense that you were talking about, the Weber sense or anything. It would be more limited than that. For that matter, I think, like in 1993-94, that for this to have any chance of Israel greatly by it, probably would mean a political change there away from the Likud. For this to have any chance of Israeli buy-in, I don't think there would. I think that it, like Germany was limited after World War I to only having so many soldiers and things like that. I think it would be like that. Yeah, Jay.
I think Dr. Wallace really touches on something really important,
Yeah.
and it's the difficult question of I don't know who in this room would entertain the possibility of Palestinians not being peoples with a culture or with a vibrant identity, but the question is the legitimacy of a government that can actually instill something like a civil society and a rule of law, et cetera, et cetera. We call Hamas a terrorist organization. That often obscures the reality that they are the political authority in Gaza. And for the political authority to make a political decision of October 7th really challenges us in the sense of thinking about what legitimate Palestinian state will look like. Now, I don't know any evidence whatsoever that there is a concerted and unified effort upon Israel's part to create something like Hamas. We know the creation of Hamas in 1988 and
I don't know if
everything
that's
else.
conspiracy theory stuff or, yeah.
Yeah, there's no
There's a
real
lot of
evidence
talk
of
out
that.
there.
But you did mention Iran, and you mentioned outside actors who support Hamas, and this is an argument that is difficult to confront. But Palestinians themselves will often identify this as one of the biggest failures in this conflict, a failure of real political leadership of the Palestinian people
Yeah.
and for the Palestinian people. And this is, I think, what it calls question to the extent to which is this a viable political authority, a set of political institutions that are in any way accountable to their people, or is this a mere terrorist group that's funded by Iran? And so that's a difficult challenge. I'm not trying to suggest one answer necessarily, but the question is a very important one.
Yeah. Well, certainly in the international law and the moral philosophers they have to meet conditions to get responsibility in order to be respected as sovereign, in order to deserve sovereignty. Arguably, they don't currently meet them, whether that's their fault, what is fault of others who are not allowing them to, who have interfered and prevented them from achieving those standards.
But what we've seen is like an increase of radicalism, obviously, on both sides. A decline of the two-state solution overall.
Yeah, sure.
Clearly, the two parties principally responsible for the erosion of the two-state solution are Israeli radicals and Palestinian radicals on
Yeah.
both sides, which are growing in power. But the reality is in both of those groups of peoples, there are still supporters of a two-state solution, advocates for peace, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah,
And their
it's
voices are being drowned by this dichotomy, this growing dichotomy of just two sides with nothing in between and not even a two-state solution.
And that's a problem too, when we just attribute our actions to states. Obviously, there are lots of people in those states who don't agree with those actions. You don't agree. Depending on how you feel about politics, you either haven't or don't agree with lots of things we've done. And at some time or another, most of us have not agreed with things we've done. And yet, now that's a problem when we talk about peoples. And so what do we mean by what the people did? Or so, is that a majority or just whoever it is that we have to treat with as representative? The United States was able to use this problem with Native American tribes to help destroy them, because you could get one community to agree to something over drinks, and they'd say, okay, Manchu Nation agreed to this, right? When they had all kinds of sub-tribes and chiefs and everything who weren't consulted. The Medicine Lodge were the Treaty of Medicine Lodge, how legitimate were those chiefs to the interests of their people or anything else, right? As you know, often even the English used to buy off the Scottish lords, right, back in the Middle Ages and so forth. You can often pay the governments of countries to let you do what you want with their people, and then could we consider them still representative in any way?
You mentioned early on one of the state justifications for having a state was that was the best way people give technique goods for living stuff religious.
Yeah.
And you put pressure on. I mean, yeah, it makes sense that they have to be part of a state, but then the specific ideas they get their own. Because you could say, well, if they're part of a state that is at least willing to do after religious rights, then it's not necessarily going to be the case that there would be an obligation to give them their own.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about. I wanted to talk a little bit. Rawls had an international version of his original position, which sort of conditions under which peoples would agree to be in multi-state states as long as they were respected. I don't know. Rawls even talks about the example of when the Ottoman Empire used to have kind of separate but equal Christian, well, they weren't really equal, the Muslims were in charge. But they had Christian and Jewish, they had significant populations of Christians and Jews who they afforded kind of sovereignty to, limited sovereignty to, although the Ottomans has final say in everything regarding war, things like that. But they had this kind of idea that it wasn't legitimate for Muslims to punish Christians or Christians to punish Muslims or Jews, but they didn't want that. It was diplomatic immunity, so it also kind of came out of that as an experiment. I think it's a line in the theory. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's just the question of an alternative instead of their own state. So we got to be part of the state. As long as that's the qualification, as long as you did not say it's nothing that just totally ignore their rights.
Yeah, I mean, we have people who are arguing with different peoples within the United States, and then the question they don't necessarily need sovereignty apart from the sovereignty of the United States. The United States, you think of multi-ethnic as well
As
as
long as they were given the state of rights to vote, that we did, that we basically recognize the citizens of that state, which is wrong.
yeah.
So just, yeah, I think if you want to have this discussion, you want to try to argue for why the one is here, why,
You can think of these rights and responsibilities of peoples as not necessarily entitled. They would only entail a right to statehood if your rights were not respected by the current political situation, which the Palestinians would obviously be able to.
But one of the thought came back and I thought it was a right to sovereignty does not in and of itself imply sovereignty of any specific territory. So even if there's a limit, I have rights on where?
Yeah, with the Palestinian territory, where it would be right to draw the lines now. And of course, I think one of the things that Rabin kind of strives for, whether intentionally or whatever, is a situation where no one would now say, well, somebody might, but not many people would now say, let's give Hayes back to the Cheyenne and Arapaho. Yeah. It was theirs, it was wrongfully taken. Let's give it back. And
Let's give the whole country back.
time, yeah, we would. But time has a way of making these things moot, and I think that could happen with Palestine, and that there are at least people in Israel who would love to see that be the outcome. So what they would love to see happen is just to become as out there, to talk about giving the Palestinian statehood, to be as out there as giving Western Kansas back to the Cheyenne and Arapaho, the Southern Appalachians back to the Cherokee or whatever.
Sure. Well,
I think we reached 1 hour, so I really appreciate Dr. Tramel's dialectical approach to this very complex and difficult question. But he raised a lot of intriguing and profound questions to this really urgent and current issue. And this semester, our theme for the ADP is civic listening. So I think this is a wonderful opening Times Talk for the whole semester. Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Coordinators Miriam and Madison, thank you for your wonderful work.